All right, so when I open up my fly box, one of the few flies that looks substantially different than anything that I see in a fly shop, a commercially tied, are my pheasant tails, especially in the trout box. And there's a few things that I think I do differently that I've learned over the years, and I don't think they're unique to me by any means. But one thing that when you're tying your pheasant tails, one thing that I always try to focus on is keeping that fly trim. Okay, they're a general mayfly nymph attractor, and they're probably one of the easiest flies to overdress. So in this video, I'm going to show you a couple tips to keeping your pheasant tails this spring nice and trim for those small mayfly hatches. First thing, I always start, my number one PT hook is a 3761 7/64 bead, size 14. Okay, so I'm going to start with A-dot camel or brown thread. And one thing that I always focus on with my PTs is I always try to keep them thin. A lot of times our pheasant tails are overly dressed, and a lot of our springtime hatches are of the PMD variety, and those flies are pretty thin. So I'm going to start with small copper wire, kind of a staple. But as I tie this in, I'm going to tie it against that hook shank. And this is going to kind of lay the foundation for the body that I'm going to create with the actual pheasant tail fibers. Next thing, I don't use a huge clump of pheasant tail. Okay. I use 3 pheasant tail fibers as a tail, because mayflies have 3 tails traditionally. I tie it in with 2 wraps. Take that thread, move it forward, and you have to be very ginger when you're only using 3 fibers. But I'm going to use those 3 fibers to build that back end just like you would with a clump of fibers. Palmering it around. And if you notice, because of the way we tied in that copper wire, it's going to give us a nice profile to the fly, in the sense of that fly is going to be wider this way than it is tall. And that's a good profile for any mayfly nymph. Take that copper wire, tack those tails down, then palmer it forward. And you can use any type of, or color of wire. You can even throw a flash rib in there if you so choose. And tie that wire down. Trim it off. Now for the back, you can use wing cases, run the gamut, right? I tend to keep it simple. I use a large piece of pearl tinsel, okay? Take it, set it on the back, tie it, make sure it kind of wraps or curves around. Trim the excess. Pull those tails out. Now, you can use dubbing if you want. I'm going to stick with the traditional peacock herl. And I take 3 strands, which sounds like a lot, but I'm not going to use all of the strand, if that makes sense. So I take 3 strands, even them up, tie them in at the tips, right up against where I tied in the flashback or the wing case. And again, my whole goal with my pheasant tails is to keep these things nice and trim. So I just palmer forward. Really not doubling up on it. And then once I get to the bead, I give it kind of a tight, and I pull that over to make sure I got the right proportions. Tie it in. And if you notice, I barely used any of those peacock herl fibers, but what I did use is that front end of it, which is going to have the shorter fibers and the nice bushy fibers. Next, for legs, you can use pheasant tail if you wish, but one thing I use, I think it moves a little better and is, I think just adds a different dynamic, is I use mallard flank. Tie it in, tuck it in. And I like a good, amount. I'm not saying you're gonna throw a whole clump in there, but I'd say about half a dozen to a dozen fibers. And I always make them, when you set them there, a little longer, because when you come tight, they're gonna get sucked into that bead. And so then at that point, they should be about the right length right there. A little bit longer. All right, once you have the legs on, then you pull that wing case over, tie it down, give it a tie in front, then tie it off. There you go. You got a nice trim pheasant tail, nice taper. For any of those spring mayfly hatches you have coming up.